interest in old buildings and history is just pretty fascinating to me. So I really appreciate your interest in it. I started working on this project in 1996. And at that time, I walked over much of the country on the Mount Hagen management area. I spent many nights sitting in the parking lot of the cross-country ski club on top of the hill, looking at the landscape up there and just enjoying the landscape and looks of things there. I know you folks have all heard about Daly. He's probably pretty well ingrained in your lives here in the town. Well, one of the things that Daly decided to make his move and develop the copper mining operation here. And when he did, he came up with a big problem right off the bat. There was no railroads into Butte until 1883. And that's when he really started construction on the thing. So he had no way of getting coal into the valley to provide his fuel source for his smelters. So that man basically said he had to use wood because that was the only fuel he had available. The supply here in Anaconda, if you get far enough away from the town and Butte, it's a fairly good supply, but around Butte itself, by the time Daly got into the copper business, they had pretty well logged off the area here for the placer mining that was going on and the silver mining that occurred after that. So that it became a problem to move wood any distance. A team of horses would probably haul a cord and a half on a wagon, and they could go make 8 or 10 miles in a day. Well, the wood supply that was available was much beyond that. So he had to develop some kind of transportation system that would bring the wood in. And his thinking at that time was he needed at least probably 250 cords of wood a day just for his smelting operation. And with the other use in the mines and so on, we're looking at probably 175 wagon loads of wood to move every day into the town. Well, this becomes an impossible feat with the distance that they had to go, because otherwise they would have to relay horses. So flume logging came into being. It all had been established here in the town of Butte, and some of the mining operations had flumes coming in and provided the wood for the Alice mine and the Boston mine in the valley here. And so it was, people knew what to do with the flumes. The first contract that he developed was he wanted 16,000 cords delivered in 1884, that's spring of 1884, to provide his first fuel for the plant. He had a gentleman by the name of, excuse me, I'm going to lose my voice for a minute. He had a gentleman by the name of David Nagel that was working for him and helping to do the leveling on his site for the smelter. He was an interesting gentleman. He was born in Boston in 1847 and moved to San Francisco and spent his early life there. While there, he gained a pretty good reputation as a man handy with a gun. He was also a gambler, a saloon keeper, and also a lawman. The interesting thing is that Nagel ends up in Tombstone when the Earp Clayton affair was going on, and he was the deputy sheriff in the town. Well, while there, he got involved in a couple of shootings but was never charged with anything. Well, after the Clayton affair, they had an election for a new sheriff, and he ran for it and didn't get the job. So he moved to Montana. Why, I have no idea. And he contacted Daly and got the job there. So Daly said, well, I have an operation. I'm building a flume up Mill Creek, and I have you to go out there with your crew and provide me with supply for the next year. He had his crew living in small log cabins out on this site, dirt floors, dirt on the roof. They spent the whole summer, the whole winter, that was their home. They didn't go back and forth. Nail didn't think much of that. He wasn't too keen on the idea of living in a drafty cabin on the job, so he elected to live in town with his family and make visits to the camp every 2 or 3 days. He would get on his horse and ride out there and check the progress of the cutter. Based on these visits and his observations, he would authorize various amounts of credit for the cutters of the company. Now, at that time, a woodcutter got paid once a year. So in the meantime, he had to have some income coming from somewhere to be able to buy supplies and to survive. So the idea was you gave credit for what you thought number of piles of wood out there, and he would get credit in the company store. Well, with him living out in the town and the fallers out there, the snow got fairly deep. And as the snow got deeper and he was not on the job, it decided that probably the woodcutters could enhance their piles a little bit by sort of rearranging the snow along with the wood. And so they would build up their stacks a little bit with a veneer of wood on the snow. And he would come out and he'd look and he'd say, okay, you get so many cords cut. And a cord, by that, if you remember, is 4 feet wide, 4 feet tall, and 8 feet long. So they would get paid, I think it was, anywhere from $1 to $2 a cord for their cutting operations. And because of their ability to enhance their piles, they had pretty good credit at the store. And they lived on that credit right to the hilt. Well, come spring, it had approached, it became time to bank up the wood by the flume. One after another of the woodcutters rolled his blankets and left the camp without measuring his wood or settling any settlement. It was obvious to them that when the snow melted in the stacks, they might come up a little short. Every trip Nagel took out, there was fewer people and more empty cabins. And he knew something was going on, and he had a pretty good idea of what it was. Not being the mildest tempered man, he became highly agitated about the affairs in the camp. One day, while riding to the camp, he met one of his woodcutters named Dave Mangus coming down the trail with his blanket on his back. He became terribly angry and ordered the man back to camp. When he declined, Nagel drew his pistol and shot him, and turned around and went into town and told the law that he had just shot and killed a guy. Well, they went out looking for him, and they met him coming to town. He wasn't dead, he was just wounded. And his fellow people there had picked him up and were hauling him into town. And Nagel put him up in the Grand Hotel in Anaconda at his expense, and he did recover. Well, there was going to be a court case in December of '85, and the only thing that ever appeared in the paper was that it was decided that they would not charge Nagel with the crime, because the person that got shot wasn't around anymore. And you can imagine that with a little money spent under the table, it would be to his advantage to leave town and get out of the area as quickly as possible. And so he did. Well, this left Daly with a problem. He now had less wood than he was supposed to have at this point, about 4,000 cords. And so he had to come up with another contract to get his wood into the area. So he put in the paper, I'm looking for a contract for 4 years for 300,000 cords. Now, you can imagine what this effect it had on the local town, when at that time, if you had a contract for 10,000 cords, you were really into the money. And here he's offering 300,000. And the one paper said, if the cords were laid end to end, they would be a pile 548 miles long. Do they realize how big that is and how much money that represents? Over $1.5 million in 1884 dollars. Well, the contract was finally bid out by a party of McLean, Caplice, and McCune. And they were railroad builders that had been working in the area. They had a couple contracts for wood as well as grading for the railroad that was coming into Anaconda. And they got the contract for about $3.49 a cord delivered at the mill. The wood cutters, they lived in the woods in their cabins, and the boss man, he went to the woods also. So he was able to keep track of his people and didn't have any problem with them using snow. Things went along pretty well up until about 1888. And then politics got involved. If anybody has read the history of Daly and Clark, you know that Clark decided he was going to run for the Senate. And of course, he and Daly did not get along at all. And Daly was under scrutiny for some of his logging practices in the Bitterroot Valley and other places. And so he was being pressured by them to own up that he had stole the timber over there. And he needed somebody in Washington that could sort of act as a shield to himself and delay the court case that he was going to hit him. So he decided that the Congress was, or the president was going to be in the Republican Party. And of course, Daly and the whole world was Democrat here. And he had to come up with a way of getting a Republican elected so he would have standing within the Congress rather than the Democrat who they would ignore. So he silently went around and convinced all his foremen that you tell your people to vote for a guy by the name of Carter. Well, everybody, you know, if you didn't vote the way he wanted, you were down the road because he would blackball anybody that didn't follow his directions. He went to Caplice and McCune and told them, I want you to have your wood choppers vote for Carter. And Caplice said, nope. He says, I'm not going to do that. He said, those folks can vote however they want to. And of course, that was, you just didn't do that with Mr. Daly. So he went to McCune and says, I don't care how we do it. Here's the money. Get rid of Caplice. And they bought him out. And the paper said, and Mr. Caplice retired with a fine amount of return on his investment. So he did okay. Well, they formed the Anaconda Fluming Company after they got rid of Caplice. Unfortunately, Daly ended up with 51% of the stock of McCune's company. Now, Daly gets to predict and decide how much the company is going to cost or to charge for the wood they had. So Daly drops the price down just so he's breaking even, and McCune is not getting any money for profit out of the deal. And so from then on, it was a downward trend between the two in their relationship. This went on for a period of time, and because of these reductions in the wages and the amount that they were paying, there became some mix-up in the bookwork. And there was a charge that Daly owed him more money than he had been paid. So finally, McCune went to Daly and says, "You owe me 16 cents more a cord for the last couple of years that we provided wood." And this represented a fairly substantial amount of money for him. And Daly said, "Yeah, if you don't like what I paid you, why, that's too bad. You can cut the contract." His lawyer said, "If you push this," he says, "they're going to take you to court and you're going to lose." And Daly said, "Oh, geez." So he said, finally said, "Okay, I will pay you what you say," and then the contract's done. And this was in 1896. And so McCune operation ended at that time. Well, this wasn't too bad for Daly, but because by that time, the railroad had arrived in Butte and Anaconda. So there was a way to bring in coal, and the infrastructure for the coal mines had developed to the point where they were able to provide coal. And so basically the smelter operation was converted to coal at that point in 1896. During that time that McCune was operating, they constructed about 37 miles of flume to haul the wood into town. I don't know if you ever have seen one of these flumes. It's basically a V-shaped structure. Water flows through and then the material can float down through the thing. And as long as it runs downhill, it does okay. Can you imagine taking a horse and a guy with a couple shovels and constructing a grade across rivers with trestles, maintaining a constant elevation drop towards town without any computers, heavy equipment? You got a horse and a pulley that you could stand stuff up with, and you had guys with shovels that could dig a hole. So it was just amazing to me the amount of effort that went into these and the amount of ability to do this with a hand compass and a couple shovels. They hauled, early estimates indicated that McCune probably took out about 1 million cords of wood in the 13 years that he was working in the area. 1 million cords. This picture here shows, they say there's about 55,000 cords on this picture. That's a whole landscape. And he took 1 million cords. So there was a little bit of an impact on the ground. Well, after he left, things were sort of quiet for a period of time until about 1905. And a guy by the name of William Allen, who was active in the gold mining operation in French Gulch. In fact, his dad was one of the first prospectors in there. and he made pretty good money out of that operation. And he was looking for other challenges, and he decided the demand for wood was still there, because they were still using wood for powering their hoist in the mine. Electricity was still not, they hadn't figured out how to apply electricity to the lift issue. Because lifting is pressure and then nothing. So they had to figure out how to harness that energy to be able to react to the lifting process. So he decided he's going to build another flume and hook onto a part of McCune's old flume on the Continental Divide and work on the Deep Creek side of the mountain, which McCune had also done. But McCune worked on the west side, I think you can say that, and Allen was going to work on the other side, the left side of the highway. Well, unfortunately, about the time he decided to do that, the land of the forest reserves at that time were transferred from the Department of Interior to the Department of Agriculture. And the Forest Service was formed and took over the management of the area. Up to that time, things had moved quite smoothly between the companies and the Department of Interior, their inspectors. They were supposed to not cut wood off the public domain, but when the inspector would come out to look around, he would look and they would always have a poker game that night. 5 of his locals were given $1,000 apiece, and the only thing they had to do was lose the money that night. And unfortunately, this went on for the whole time period that McCune was in operation. And the newspapers carried reports about some guy had cut 200 cords off of some public land and had been charged because he was stealing, but they could never find the 1 million cord that came off of McCune's operation. Well, Fire Service said, geez, we have an issue because we're a new organization. Nobody likes us because we are imposing regulation on these people and we're charging them before they were getting it for free. There was a whole series of bills in Congress to try and get rid of the Forest Service. I mean, they wanted to get it. The locals did not appreciate this at all. So the Forest Service said, we have to somehow work a deal. And they did. They said, we will make a sale to you for what you have cut already, and then we'll allow another sale that you can harvest on for a period of time. So that's what they did. Well, Allen might have been a good gold miner, but he sure wasn't much of a logger supervisor. And he continually was in trouble with the Forest Service because he wasn't paying to keep track up with the amount he was cutting. So they would go along and they would come up and say, okay, you owe us so much money, and if you don't pay, we're shutting you down. And they'd shut him down, and he'd finally round up some dollars, pay them, and they would go for another couple months. Well, this was on back and forth between about 1905 and 1910. This occurred. If you've been in that area, around the ski area, that was where he did most of his logging. And if you walk through there, you're going to find piles of cordwood stacked on the ground that were left by his operation. At the head of Little California Creek, there are 3 or 4 huge piles of material that were left, thousands of cord apparently, because there wasn't enough water to run the flume that they had built up there. So he was not really a good manager. And finally the company said, we have to stabilize this because we're not our supply of wood is not too secure, and we need to be able to take care of that. So they went to Alan and told him, he said, we will buy you out, pay your whatever you have owed in various places, take all your mining claims, take the flume, take your phone, they had a phone line too, and your animals and all your equipment, and we will take over the operation. And they went to the Forest Service and said, if you will transfer that contract from Alan to us, we will do the logging from there on. And they formed the Montana Timber Company. And they brought in a fellow by the name of Nels Pearson, who was logging in the Willow Creek area and had been there for a number of years. They gave him $15,000 a year to run the operation. In today's money, that'd be almost $500,000. They gave him a house in French Gulch, which, you know, I'm not sure that's such a big deal. The house just sat out in the middle of nowhere with the plastering all the way around it, so it wasn't a very attractive area. And they also gave him a Stevens Duray touring car that he could ride around to check the area. Well, he was pretty effective. He was a good logger, and he had things going quite well for him. And they continued operation up until about 1917, when the contracts finally finished up. During that time, the loggers lived on the site, and as they would move through the sale area, they would have a cabin here, and then they would get too far away from the work area, so they'd go and build another cabin over here that was where they were working. And so as you move through the area out there, you'll find these cabins scattered all the way through the area. And I located almost 300 cabins just on the big whole side of the divide that were left, that these loggers had built and then abandoned after they moved on to the next area to cut. So they were living out there until that time. Well, when they finally closed out the sale in 1917, that pretty well finished the logging in Daly, in Deep Creek, Mill Creek, and Willow Creek. They basically had logged it out. There was nothing left for them to go after. Along with that, there was a number of fires that had occurred in the area during that time frame and had burned up a bunch of the material also. So the area was pretty well taken care of. Well, when the Forest Service came in and started looking at the area and called Alan, they recognized also the pass cutting that had gone on. And so they made an attempt to try and get the money off the people that had cut those in the past. So they started going after people, and one of them was Nels Pearson, because he had been logging in Willow Creek and just taking the material out of there. So the fellow that was there before him was a guy by the name of Decay, and they got to Decay and said, you are charged with taking so many thousand cords of wood out. And they decided it was going to be difficult to determine if Decay cut it, or Nels cut it, or there was a Dupay in there also at one time. So the Forest Service really didn't have a strong case, and so Decay said, I will show you my books and give you information about what McCune did if you let me off. Never saw that happen before. So that's what happened, and they walked. And it ended up, the only person they charged was the Anaconda Company, which was Hagen at that time, because everybody else had died by then, of the group that originally started. So they went after him, and as I mentioned earlier, they said that McCune had taken about 1 million cord. Well, Carter's back in Washington, working the line back there, and he's maneuvering things. And they said, well, you can't charge that because of this, and you can't charge that because of that. And they ended up nibbling away until they were down to 700,000 cord that they were going to charge him with. The price tag was about 1.4 million damage that they charged the company with, which is about 46 million in today's money. Well, this went on for a period of years between the time they first charged him, about 1911, 1912, until they finally settled. And they ended up settling for $150,000. Wow. And there was no attempt to charge anybody for the damage to the ground through the smelter fumes till later, much later, about the 1930s, before they finally settled up some of those cases. But with that demise, they ended up with probably about 55 miles of flume that had been constructed between the various operations to bring wood to the town. They took out in excess of 1 million cords, plus what they took out as lagging and stalls for the mills, or for the mines themselves, plus the firewood that went to the lift in the various mining operations. Nobody ever put a figure on exactly how much was taken during that time period. That really isn't the end of the story, because probably the most important part of this story is about the men who did the work, that were out there living in the woods in a very tough situation. It wasn't uncommon for trees to fall on people, or an axe slip and cut off a person's foot, or get shot because they were depressed and living in a little cabin out in the middle of nowhere with nobody around. And when you get up to be my age, you start thinking, I can't make a cord today anymore. And what am I going to do to survive if I can't cut enough wood to get my money? And they would go into depression, and most of them were single. Over 80% of the fallers were single people. A lot of them had come over from the old country, and their wives, if they had one, was still back there, and some passed without ever being able to meet their wife again because they died on the operation. Where they came from, how they lived, and in some cases how they died, was really what is intriguing. And they made it happen for Daly, that he could make his empire. I'll answer any questions if you have.
Where was the smelter?
The smelter?